Welcome to In the Garden. I'm your host, Master Gardener Joyce Hochsprung. Today we're going to talk about plants for full sun. And I sent out a request on Facebook asking people what topics they might like me to cover, and that was one of them. So we're going to talk about that. Now, full sun is generally considered 6 to 8 hours per day. So considering that we have 12 to 16 hours of daylight during our growing season, we tend to think of an 8-hour day like a work day. Oh, it's got to have 8 solid hours. Not necessarily. It could have 4 in the morning, 4 in the late afternoon, or kind of interspersed in there. And luckily, for people that are looking for pretty much full sun plants, there are tons of them. Now, I suspect that a lot of times when people ask about that, what they're really wondering is, what are some drought-tolerant ones? There are some. Now, drought-tolerant doesn't mean you can just plant them and forget them. They still need some care, and that first year especially, even the most drought-tolerant plants, their first year they're going to need watering, regular, deep watering. Not just a shallow little sprinkle, but a good deep soaking. And probably mulch for a lot of them. So we're going to try to address all that in this episode, and we're going to just start out over here. Most of this bed would get what I consider full sun. It may not be in full sun the entire day, but the majority of it, other than a few pockets here and there, get at least 8 hours of sun during the course of the day. So we're going to just walk through and look at some of these, and as we go I'll try to mention which ones tend to be the most drought tolerant. And again, like I said, that doesn't mean you get by without ever watering. It means you don't have to water them as often. And I have some that we're going to talk about that I have a hard time growing here because my soil is definitely not well drained. Even after almost 30 years of amending soil and stuff, there are still areas where if we get a wet year, I could lose some of those drought-tolerant plants if I were to plant them. They would simply rot out on me. So let's just kind of start over here. Peonies are a full sun plant. This one happens to be an Ito peony, which is a cross. And they don't like it too wet. So when I planted this, I amended the soil like crazy because this isn't something you dig up every 2 or 3 years to divide. And if you've ever divided a peony, you know what I'm talking about. The last time I did it, when I had to move a bunch because we were going to be building the shed over here, it took me almost 2 hours per peony to get them out of the ground, trying to get as much root as I could. So it's not a endeavor to be taken lightly, but they are a good one. They're also fairly drought tolerant. For one of the very drought tolerant ones is this yarrow or achillea. Now there are a couple different kinds. This is Achillea filipendula, and you can see the leaf. It's got kind of a grayish silvery cast to it. In general, plants that have a silvery leaf tend to be more drought tolerant because if they're a hairy leaf or a spiny or a silvery, they lose less water. So these are more drought tolerant. Now there's also Achillea millefolium, which is the really fine, ferny, lacy one. I don't grow that one. My soil is too rich and it just runs rampant, so the filipendulas tend to stay in a clump. The clump expands, but they don't run like the others do. Now if you have real dry, sandy, rocky, crummy soil, a spot there, the millefolium ones might be perfect for you. Unfortunately, the filipendulas, only come in this yellow or one called Coronation Gold, so you don't have the color choices. Okay, daylilies, there's just 1 or 2 coming into bloom. We're not quite into daylily season here yet. are, once they're established, once you have the clump established, because they have those somewhat tuberous roots, are fairly drought tolerant. Now, they still prefer, if you want really good bloom, they would like at least an inch of water a week, but the plant is probably not going to die if they don't get that. So they're a good one. Asters like it moist, so full sun, but they're probably not on the drought tolerant list. We also have lilies for full sun. Most lilies love being in full sun. Some of the orientals might prefer a little afternoon shade from the really hot sun. I don't grow orientals because they simply they don't last long. They don't multiply here. They like an acidic soil and a longer growing season than we have. But the Asiatics do very well. They love full sun, although they'll tolerate a little bit of shade. And they are fairly, because they're a bulb, after they bloom, they don't really care if they get more rain or not. So you don't have to give them a whole lot of water after the bloom is done. Up until they bloom, you want to keep them evenly moist if you can. But after that, you're good. I like those kind of species looking ones, candelabra look, where they face down. That one I believe is Adrienne or something like that. But they're just fun, and they don't take up a lot of space. You can tuck them in almost anywhere. First of my coneflowers is starting to bloom. Now, as far as coneflowers like full sun, they'll also tolerate a little shade. If you want, the most drought tolerant ones are the plain old-fashioned prairie coneflower, the purple ones. These are not quite as drought tolerant as they are, but to a degree. You're still going to have to give them some water. Another plant for full sun is milkweed. This one is swamp milkweed. It's in bloom right now. You can see we've got some bees on there already. Definitely does not like to dry out. This one is not a drought tolerant one. It likes that nice, evenly moist, well-drained soil that everybody tries to have. And very few of us really do. This one is not in bloom yet, but these are balloon flowers, and they'll bloom a little bit later. I see they're starting to form a few buds at the tips. Because they have a taproot, a really long taproot, they're quite drought tolerant. They're kind of a plant that decide where you want to put them, because you can move the seedlings easily, but the mature ones, you're going to be doing a lot of digging deep. And then it's not a given that they're going to make the move. So, but that's a good one for full sun, and also tolerates a fair amount of shade and still blooms. Not quite as heavily, but will still bloom. This clump is almost finished, but this is another type of iris for full sun. It's a Sudata iris, which is a cross between, I can't remember, but it's a cross made in the lab at some point. And this one likes it moist. So if you've got a wet spot, the Sudatas are great for that. In a little bit, we're going to go over to another type of iris that likes it drier, like the tall beardeds. But these are a fun one. These are also a nice full sun plant, along with the daisies that are just coming into bloom. Now, this is Lychnis chalcedonica, often known as Maltese cross, because if you look closely at each bloom floret, it's kind of in the shape of a Maltese cross. This is what's considered scarlet. To me it's orange, but hey, people that know more than I do call it scarlet, okay. The daisies, this is Becky. She's just about ready to open here. They like full sun. And Shasta daisies they want good drainage. People say, oh, my Shasta daisies always die. It's not always so much a hardiness issue as it is that winter drainage. If they get a spot where like snow melt sits or something like that, you're probably going to lose them. and they're borderline hardy here. But I like them so much that if I do lose it, I replace it. So, but they're a great full sun plant. Semi-drought tolerant. They don't like to dry out too much, but they'll let you know because they'll just start drooping and tell you, hey, I want a drink. So that's kind of a fun thing. Down here, not quite in bloom yet, we have Liatris, or blazing star. Gay feather, it's also sometimes called. That's a native. There are different varieties. Some are taller, some are shorter. I had the really tall one and I lost it, and I think what I have left is kobold probably. But they're fairly drought tolerant too. Again, they grow from a small bulb or corm, and a lot of bulbous plants or things that grow from bulbs tend to be more drought tolerant. As you can see, I've got quite a few lilies in here. More daylilies. Chianti just opened up this morning here, so that's kind of a fun older one. Kind of hard to find in the trade now. You rarely see it anymore, but I've had that one for many years. Clematis, there's a purple one back here. I think it's indigo sapphire, or it might be sapphire indigo. I can never remember. But this one is actually kind of more of a trellis one. I've just trained it up this old headboard and clipped it along the line. And that's kind of a fun one. Doesn't get too tall, so you don't need a really big trellis for it. Or you could let it scramble over a wall or something like that too. Again, they like the cool roots, evenly moist soil. And if you have trouble with the big flowered clematis, which I do out here on the prairie, the wind breaks the stems, and then I have brown clematis, so I finally got rid of those and said, okay, they're not going to work where I am, so I went with what does work. So we've got this one. I guess we kind of went by the one on the trellis back over there with the pink flowers. That's Princess Diana. That one is definitely a climber. I put a new tutor in there this year, got it 2 feet higher than the one that was in there, and I can see it's probably not tall enough. This is Deervilla. It's our native honeysuckle. And it will be, the blooms aren't real big and showy, but it will literally be in bloom almost the entire summer. And the bees love it. I've got about 5 or 6 bumblebees buzzing right in this area right now. So it's kind of, this one is Kodiak red. And you can see the new growth has a little bit of a reddish tinge to it. And the one thing about this that I will warn you about, expect to do a little root pruning around it every spring because it does sucker somewhat. So the clump will keep getting bigger. So once it's reached the size you want it to be, you need to get in there with a sharp shovel around the base and remove some of the suckers. Okay, this guy is almost finished. This is the other iris besides bearded iris that I was talking about as being a good sun plant. These aren't grown a lot around here. I actually found out about them from our local gardener, Jerry Brown, who used to have Brown's Greenhouse. I got a couple from him, this one, and there's a blue one that's finished blooming further back. But they like full sun, although they'll grow with some shade. And these actually would prefer not to get too much water after they're done blooming. So, and in places where they are, oh, how shall I say it, where they don't get supplemental water, they will simply go dormant for the rest of the season and start growth with new growth again in the fall. I wish these were more widely available. I've ordered a couple more. I've planted 2 new ones last fall that didn't bloom yet this spring, and I have another one coming this fall. And then I think I have to stop because I won't have any place to put them. But you really don't, I divided this one last year, which I know you look at that and go, really? But I took out over half of the clump last year and gave away I don't know how many, and some ended up in the compost. And but on these, when they're done blooming, and I was going to wait until these last few blooms are done, go all the way down to the base and cut out the bloom stalk. And in case I didn't tell you, these are Spuria iris. I do not know the name of this variety, but if you Google them, it's Spuria. There are a couple online sources that I found that sell them. And you plant them in the fall. Like I said, don't expect bloom the first, the following season, but by next year I should probably have bloom on the two that I planted. Okay, some more asters down here. Something else that is quite drought tolerant is creeping phlox or moss phlox. Generally, plants that have these really fine or needle-like leaves tend to be fairly drought tolerant because they simply don't lose as much moisture to wind and sun as larger leaf plants do. So that's a good one if you want a drought tolerant one that you don't want to have to spend a lot of time watering. And remember, you still have to water to get it established. This is a native grass. This one is blue grama. And this one is blonde ambition, so it'll send up little spikes later in the summer, towards fall, about August or so. And they're just kind of golden seed heads that they look like little flags coming off the stem, is the best way I can describe it. But you see it's a very fine textured grass. You do have to give this one really good drainage. So before I planted this, I worked in a ton of compost and loosened the soil way down and everything I could to find it. And I was hopeful that being on a slope, that would give it the drainage it needs. And so far, so good. It's been here 5 years and we've been making it, so I think we're good on that one. Okay. Oh, my weed. See, I do have weeds. Okay, this is a potentilla, and this will grow in part shade, which is kind of why I have it in this area, because until I lost that tree, this was shaded part of the day. So, and this will grow sun or shade. This one happens to be Monarch's Velvet, and it's just covered with tiny little reddish, they look like red velvet flowers later in the summer. It's also a prolific reseeder. It's fairly drought tolerant. It's, again, it'll let you know if it's not happy, but yeah, it's a great one for full sun. It seems to take the heat, the sun. I mean, this went from, a fair amount of shade to almost full sun, and it's doing just fine, so, but it will tolerate some shade. Here's kind of a fun annual for full sun. Although it will grow in some shade, it gets kind of floppy. This is just an annual poppy. Double form, I have no idea what the variety is. My grandmother used to grow it, so it's been around a long time. I got some seeds from my mom and started them here, and they just kind of pop up here and there, and I spend a lot of time weeding some of them out in the spring, but they're kind of a fun full sun annual that will reseed quite prolifically. We've got some more lilies in here. This orange one has just been opening up the last few days. That's Forever Susan. The salvias, if you can see this purple back here, that one's almost done and ready to be cut back. But they like full sun and are fairly drought tolerant. They've got that little bit smaller leaf. So here we have, of course, the sedums are always good drought tolerant full sun plants, and there are so many varieties of sedums out there. If you start Googling them, you'll find all kinds of them. They're great. I mean, I love sedums, which is bad for me because I don't have great drainage. But so I have to get creative with little mounds, making them a little bit higher than the surrounding soil and stuff. But if you have a hot, dry, sunny spot, sedums, and there are tall ones, medium-sized ones, creeping ones, clump-forming short ones, all kinds. This is another Lychnis chalcedonica, but this is the pink version. I know there's a tag in there somewhere. I want to say dusky pink or something. I have not ever seen these plants available, but you can get the seeds. I think I got the seed either from Annie's Annuals or Select Seeds. I don't remember. It's been a few years now. But so if you don't like the orange, the pink is another possibility for you. We're lucky enough that we've got some flax blooming yet over here. That won't be lasting too much longer, but the blue flax on the end is quite drought tolerant. You've got those tiny little leaves, remember? And there again, it likes that good winter drainage. The ones that do the best for me and get the biggest are in another area. These just kind of blew in here, and I said, yeah, you can stay, so whatever. But they do like that good winter drainage again. So there's some more sedums down there. Those are getting a little more water than they like when I water. As you can see, they're kind of opening up in the middle. I don't know the name of that one for sure. It was gifted to me by a friend. And again, the lilies are quite drought tolerant. This one over here is Latvia. And the Asiatics and the LAs are really just coming into bloom. And I talked about the grasses. This really fine textured one. And I started with a division about this big 5 years ago. And this is prairie dropseed, which is another native grass. Also very good for native butterflies and skippers. Drought tolerant. This one does get some water, but it's kind of at the end of it. And this sprinkler head goes that way, so it doesn't get a ton of extra water here. But it is really fun when it blooms towards fall. It's just these airy seed heads, and it'll kind of swirl and twirl, and it's just a really pretty one of my favorites. I have it in several beds. Okay, here's another plant that's fairly drought tolerant. It's a Veronica. I especially like this one. It's a little bit taller. There are some tall varieties. The majority are shorter, so if you want an edger. And they don't like to be too wet, so they're fairly drought tolerant. This one I like because the leaf edges have a little bit of cream on them. And this one is called Charlotte, white one, and it's kind of just a fun one. I like the Veronicas. They give that nice vertical accent look. And I almost forgot about good old garden phlox, tall garden phlox for full sun, although they will tolerate a little shade and do fairly well. Of course, they aren't blooming yet, but they're happy in full sun. They don't want it too dry. They're not as drought tolerant as, say, your salvias and your creeping phlox. Like I said, anything with a fine leaf or a silvery leaf or a felted leaf like lamb's ear, which rots out for me here most years, so I don't even bother with it anymore. This year would probably be the year to grow it, but this is a big blue stem. We'll see how tall it gets this year with not too much rain, but last year it was easily at least 7 feet tall when it was in bloom, because you have to add the bloom stalks on. And this is Rain Dance, I think. I think it may have eaten my tag, but here's another full sun plant, Helenium. These bloom more towards fall, late summer, fall. They do like to be kept a little bit more moist. They want good drainage, but they don't want to dry out too much, but they're happy with full sun. And I think, let me just take a look around. Oh, how could I forget this one? This is a variation on a native. This is sweet coneflower. Again, I don't think it's going to get quite as tall this year because of lack of rain. So it does prefer a little more even moisture, not moderately evenly moist, not soggy, but conditions. Normally that one would get about like this. I don't think we're going to make that this year. This is the variety Henry Ehlers. It's got yellow, a soft kind of lemony, not quite that bright, but a soft yellow quilled flower, which is really fun, like in arrangements and things. But it likes its full sun. We talked about sedums. This one down here is a ground cover sedum. This one is just coming into bloom. This is John Creech. It makes a really dense ground cover, so it chokes out quite a few weeds. One exception is the oxalis or wood sorrel. That manages to creep in there, but it does a good job. And this one down here gets walked on by me and the puppy all the time, so it's fairly resilient. This is, I believe, acre. It was here when I moved in, and I've done my best to identify it. I think it's acre. So just to recap, what I just want to say, for the really drought tolerant ones, look for things with silver leaves, fine or spiny leaves, deep taproots. If you've got, and you want to, if you can, group those together. Maybe you have an area that you just don't get to or can't get to easily to water. You know, you'll have to water them to get them established, but after that, in all but the worst droughts, they'll hang in there pretty well once they're established. So again, silver leaves, felted or woolly fuzzy leaves, thin or spiny leaves, or real thin like on the creeping phlox, and deep taproots. If it's a taprooted plant, it's probably going to be pretty drought tolerant. Hope I helped you out with some ideas. Thanks for joining us in the garden. See you next time.